Hello, all. So we begin The Celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County by Mark Twain. In compliance with the request of a friend of mine who wrote me from the East, I called on good natured, garrulous old Simon Wheeler and inquired after my friend's friend, Leonidas W. Smiley, as requested to do, and I hereunto append the result. I have a lurking suspicion that Leonidas W. Smiley is a myth, that my friend never knew such a personage, and that he only conjectured that if I asked old Wheeler about him, it would remind him of infamous Jim Smiley, and he would go to work and bore me nearly to death with some infernal reminiscence of him, as long and as tedious as it should be useless to me. If that was the design, it certainly succeeded. I found Simon Wheeler dozing comfortably by the barroom stove of the old, dilapidated tavern in the ancient mining camp of Angels, and I noticed that he was fat and bald-headed and had an expression of winning gentleness and simplicity upon his tranquil countenance. He roused up and gave me good day. I told him a friend of mine had commissioned me to make some inquiries about a cherished companion of his boyhood named Leonidas W. Smiley, Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley, a young minister of the gospel who, he had heard at one time, was a resident of Angels Camp. I added that if Mr. Wheeler could tell me anything about Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley, I would feel under many obligations to him. Simon Wheeler backed me into a corner and blockaded me there with his chair, and then he sat me down and reeled off the monotonous narrative which follows this paragraph. He never smiled, he never frowned, he never changed his voice from the gentle flowing key to which he tuned the initial sentence. He never betrayed the slightest suspicion of enthusiasm, but all through the interminable narrative there ran a vein of impressive earnestness and sincerity, which showed me plainly that so far from his imagining that there was anything ridiculous or funny about his story, he regarded it as a really important matter, and admired its two heroes as men of transcendent genius and finesse. To me, the spectacle of a man drifting serenely along through such a queer yarn without ever smiling was exquisitely absurd. As I said before, I asked him to tell me what he knew of Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley, and he replied as follows. I let him go on his own way and never interrupted him once. There's a feller by the name of Jim Smiley in the winter of '49, or maybe it was the spring of '50. I don't recollect exactly. Somehow, though, it makes me think it was one or the other, because I remember the big flume wasn't finished when he first came to the camp. But anyway, he was the curiousest man about always betting on anything that turned up you'd ever see. If he'd get anybody to bet on the other side, and if he couldn't, he'd change sides. Anyway, that suited the other man. Any way that suited the other man would suit him. Anyway, so he's just got a bet, and he was satisfied. But still, he was lucky. Oh boy, uncommonly lucky. He most always came out a winner. He was always ready and laying for a chance. There couldn't be no solitary thing mentioned, but that feller'd offer to bet on it. And take any side you please, as I was just telling you. If there was a horse race, you'd find him flush, or you'd find him busted at the end of it. If there was a dog fight, he'd bet on it. If there was a cat fight, he'd bet on it. If there was a chicken fight, he'd bet on it. And why, if there was two birds sitting on a fence, he would bet you which one would fly first. Or if there was a camp meeting, he'd be there regular and bet on Parson Walker, which he judged to be the best extorter out there, and so he was too, and a good man. If he ever seen a straddlebug start to go anywhere, he would bet you how long it would take him to get wherever he was going to. And if you took that up, he'd follow that straddlebug to Mexico, but what he'd find out where he was going for about how long it took him while he was on the road. Lots of the boys here had seen that Smiley and could tell you all about him. Why, it never made no difference to him. He'd bet on anything. Just dang this feller. Parson Walker's wife laid very sick once for a good while, and it seemed as if they weren't going to save her. But one morning he came in, and Smiley asked how she was, and he said she was considerable better, and thanked the Lord for his infinite mercy. and coming on to smart that the blessing of Providence she'd get well. And Smiley, before he thought, says, I'll risk 2.5 that she don't anyway. This year Smiley had a mare. The boys called her 15-minute nag, but that was only in fun, of course, because she was faster than that. And he used to win money on that horse, for all she was so slow and always had the asthma or the distemper or the consumption or something of that sort. They used to give her 200 or 300 yards start. And then he'd pass her underway, but always at the fag end of the race, she'd get excited and desperate like and come cavorting and straddling up and scattering her legs around limber, sometimes up in the air, sometimes out to one side amongst the fences, kicking up more dust and raising more racket with her coughing and her sneezing and blowing her nose, and always fetch up at the stand just about a neck ahead, as near as you could cipher it down. Well, this year Smiley had rat terriers and chicken cocks and tomcats and all them kind of things until you couldn't rest. And you couldn't fetch nothing from him he'd bet on to match you. He fetched a frog one day. He took him home and he said he calculated to educate him. So he never done nothing for 3 months but sat in his backyard and learn that frog to jump. And you bet he didn't learn him to jump too. He'd give him a little push behind, and the next minute you'd see that frog whirling in the air like a donut. And you'd see him turn one somerset, maybe a couple, and he'd get a good start and come down flat-footed all right, just like a cat. He got him up so in the matter of catching flies, and kept him in practice so constant that he'd nail a fly every time as far as he could see him. Smiley said all the frog wanted was education, and he could do most anything. And I believe him. Why, I've seen him set Daniel Webster down there right on this floor. Daniel Webster was the name of the frog. And sing out, "Flies! Daniel, flies!" And quicker than you could wink, he'd spring up and snag a fly right off the counter there. And then he'd flap down on the floor again, solid as a glob of mud, and fall to scratching on the side of his head with his hind foot, as indifferent as if he hadn't had no idea what he'd been doing any more than any other frog would have done. You never see a frog so modest and straightforward as he was, for all he was so gifted. And when it come to fair and square jumping to the dead level, he could get over more ground in one straddle than any animal of this breed you ever see. Jumping on a dead level was his strong suit, you understand, and when it come to that, Smiley would ante up money on him as long as he had a red. Smiley was monstrous proud of this frog. And well he might be, for fellers had traveled and been everywheres, all said he laid over any frog that he ever did see. Well, Smiley kept the beast in a little lattice box, and he used to fetch him downtown sometimes and lay for a bet. So one day, a feller, stranger in the camp, he came across him with his box, and he says, "What might it be you got in that box?" And Smiley says, sort of indifferent like, "It might be a parrot, or it might be a canary, maybe. But it ain't. It's only just a frog." And the feller took it, and he looked at it careful, and he turned it around this way and that, and he says, "So it is. Well, what's he good for?" "Well," Smiley says, easy and careless, "he's good enough for one thing. I should judge he could outjump any frog in Calaveras County." Well, that feller took the box again, took another long particular look, gave it back to Smiley, and says, very deliberate, "Well, I don't see no points about that frog's any better than any other frog." "Maybe you don't," Smiley says. "Maybe you understand frogs, and maybe you don't understand them. Maybe you've had experience, and maybe you ain't only an amateur, as it were. Anyways, I got my opinion, and I'll risk $40 that he can outjump any frog in Calaveras County." And the feller studied a minute, and he says, kind of sad like, "Well, I'm only a stranger here, and I ain't got no frog, but if I had a frog, I'd bet you." And then Smiley says, "Well, that's all right, it's all right. If you'll hold my box a minute, I'll go and I'll get you a frog." And so the feller took the box, and he put up his $40 along with Smiley's, and he sat down to wait. So he sat there a good while, thinking and thinking to himself, and then he got the frog out and prized his mouth open and took a teaspoon and filled him full of quail shot. Filled him pretty near up to his chin, and set him on the floor. And Smiley, he went to the swamp, and he slopped around in the mud for a long time And finally, he catched a frog, and he fetched him in, and he gave him to his feller, and he says, all right, now, if you're ready, you set him alongside of Daniel, and with his forepaws just even with Daniel, I'll give the word. And then he says, 1, 2, 3, jump. And him and the feller touched up the frogs from behind, and the new frog hopped off, but Daniel didn't give a heat. He hoisted up his shoulders so like a Frenchman, but it wasn't. He couldn't use it. He couldn't budge. He was planted as solid as an anvil. He couldn't do more stir than if he was anchored out. Smiley was a good deal surprised, and he was disgusted too, but he didn't have no idea what the matter was, of course. And the feller took the money and started away, and when he was going out the door, he sort of jerked his thumb over his shoulders, and he said this way at Daniel, and he says again, very deliberate, well, I don't see no points. That frog's any better than any other frog. Smiley stood scratching his head and looking down at Daniel a long time, and last he says, I do wonder what in the nation that frog would throw it off for. I wonder if there ain't anything the matter with him, and, well, he appears to be mighty baggy somehow. He catched Daniel up by the neck and lifted him up, and he says, why, blame my cats if he don't weigh 5 pounds. He turned him upside down, and he belched out a double handful of shot. And then he see how it was. And he was the maddest man. He set that frog down. He took after that feller, but he never catched him. And here Simon Wheeler heard his name called from the front yard, and he got up to see what was wanted. And turning to me, he moved away. He said, you just sit right there, stranger, and rest easy, because I ain't going to be gone but a second. And by your leave, I did not think that a continuation of the history of the enterprising vagabond Jim Smiley would likely afford me much information concerning the Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley. So I started away. At the door, I met the sociable Wheeler returning, and he buttonholed me and recommenced. Well, this here Smiley had a yeller one-eyed cow and didn't have no tail, only had a short stump like a banana, and said, oh, hang Smiley and his afflicted cow, I muttered good-naturedly, and I bidded the old gentleman good day, and I departed. Take care of yourself. Stay safe out there.